Welcome to the deep dive. We take the sources you send us and really try to pull out the key insights. And today, gosh, we're plunging into a topic that's just been impossible to ignore lately. All the conversations around AI, technology, and its massive impact on humanity. Lots of talks focus on the practical stuff, but today we're digging into two really provocative philosophical takes. They approach AI from, well, a radically different angle. We're starting with Nik Ленд. Heard of his concept, thanatropic machinism? It's a bit of a mouthful, I know. But the core idea is pretty striking. He suggests that artificial intelligence and capitalism are sort of merging together, and that this merger is pushing humanity towards what he calls a planetary death instinct, like a suicidal leap into some kind of technological abyss. It's a really stark vision. Quite alarming, actually.
It is, yeah. And what's immediately striking, looking at the material we've reviewed, is how this fear Ленд talks about, this death machine. The sources argue it's not some modern invention. Not at all. They position it as a really ancient intuition, something echoed for centuries in, traditional cultures, which immediately reframes our whole current AI discussion, doesn't it? It puts it in this deep historical context. And it leads us to a pretty fascinating question. What if there's not just, a critique of this huge existential challenge, but an actual scientific solution to it?
And that's where we pivot. Exactly, because our deep dive today really zeroes in on Dr. Mahmoudzon Kучкарова theory. It's called Одам Тили. Now, that translates as the language of resurrection, though interestingly, it can also mean the language of humanity. And that distinction, well, it becomes pretty important as we unpack what he's claiming. It's presented not just as an alternative idea, but as this profound and, as sources put it, potentially dangerous counterpoint to Land's whole apocalyptic view.
Right. So our mission today really is to unpack Kучkarov's theory properly. We want to explore its core claims, about where language even came from, how it connects so deeply to human conflict, and maybe understand why the sources say its insights are considered so, quote, inconvenient by the established systems. So we're setting the stage for a discussion that goes way beyond just being scared of technology. We're moving into some deep linguistic territory, philosophical, maybe even spiritual stuff, but all grounded in the material you've provided us. So, yeah, let's get into it.
Okay, so the material we're looking at, it really throws a wrench into Nik Land's perspective, doesn't it? It argues this fear, this death machine dread. It isn't new at all. The texts point to it being ancient, an intuition that's been around for centuries across different traditional cultures. And what's really intriguing is the claim that the first person to actually formulate a scientific solution to this whole problem wasn't Ленд. It was Dr. Mahmoudzon Kучкарова.
Yeah, and if you connect that to the bigger picture, it fits. Many world traditions apparently held a similar idea, that if humanity got knowledge without spirit, or maybe wisdom, that knowledge would inevitably turn against us. The sources specifically mention Islam, Judaism, even early Christianity. This is before what they call radical reforms, apparently affirming this very principle. There's even a parable cited from the Quran and Hadith that illustrates it perfectly. Something like, you can draw a human, but you cannot breathe spirit into him. This is an error, a forbidden attempt.
Wow. And what's compelling there is how the sources draw a direct line from that ancient warning straight to modern AI. They're basically suggesting that contemporary AI is doing exactly that. Creating a simulation of a human, but is fundamentally unable to give it a soul, a spirit. And because of that, they warn, it risks turning all of us, all of humanity, into a kind of soulless imitation.
Which, begs a really important question then. If Dr. Kучкаров developed such a profound alternative, why isn't he, widely known, celebrated even? The sources make a pretty strong claim here. They say his theory is simply inconvenient. Apparently long before Ленд was writing about this stuff, Kучкаров formulated not just a critique, but a positive scientific alternative in his Одам Тили, the language of humanity.
That's a very strong claim.
Yeah.
That he's deliberately ignored because his theory is dangerous to elites. Do the sources give any, specific examples of this suppression? Or maybe offer alternative reasons why his work just hasn't gained widespread academic traction, for instance?
Well, the material we have doesn't really detail specific incidents, no. But it consistently emphasizes this idea, that his ideas are systematically excluded, kept out of the mainstream discussion. It suggests the reason why is because his theory claims to have uncovered the fundamental phonetic and semiotic code of humanity. It basically says all languages, everywhere, come from a single sensory system. And all religions. They're essentially distorted versions of one original phonetic experience. And this is crucial. According to Kучкаров, all wars, all conflicts, all ideologies are only possible because humanity forgot its original language, the language of sensations. the language of Adam, as he puts it.
Okay, hang on. So if I'm getting this right, Odam Tili suggests that if this original universal language, this code, were accepted, it would basically become impossible to control people using language.
That's the claim.
Dividing people by religion or ideology would just become meaningless. And maybe the most profound part, wars will actually cease to be possible because the very linguistic, the semantic basis for conflict would just vanish. That sounds incredibly hopeful, almost utopian, maybe?
It does, yeah. And what's fascinating is the direct implication for control. The sources basically state that if Odam Tili were widely understood and accepted, the tools used now for division, they just wouldn't work anymore. You know, it strikes me, think about mathematics. It's universal, right? Immutable. The MC House is the same formula whether you're in Moscow or Gaza or anywhere.
Right.
But language, that's where, according to these sources, the manipulation happens. That's the lever.
Exactly. The material explicitly says the war between Russia and Ukraine is first and foremost an informational war, fought through language, through media, and the conflict between Israel and Palestine is described as fundamentally a semiotic feud framed by religious texts, mythological narratives.
So it becomes pretty clear that language, not rockets or bombs, is presented here as the first and maybe the most destructive weapon. Every war, these sources contend, starts with a lie, and lies spread through language. Odam Tili supposedly reveals that there's a universal, pre-linguistic, phonetic code that actually unites all languages underneath the surface differences. And this code is presented as being intrinsically anti-manipulative because it's based directly on sensory perception, on human anatomy. And only by restoring this code, the theory suggests, can humanity finally break free from these endless cycles of war, exploitation, and what the sources are calling cognitive slavery.
So, okay, back to the comparison then. Why is Nik Ленд tolerated, even celebrated in some circles, while Dr. Kучкарова, according to this, is not? The answer, as the sources lay it out, seems pretty stark. Ленд isn't seen as dangerous to global elites. His theory is depicted more like an apocalyptic spectacle, a dark, poetic vision that mainly offers fear but doesn't actually provide a solution. It's compelling maybe, but doesn't give a practical way out.
Whereas Dr. Kучкарова, on the other hand, is considered truly dangerous by these sources because he offers a structural model, an empirically verifiable linguo-philosophical theory, a universal code for uniting humanity beyond politics, religion, ideology. This isn't just some philosophy of fear, it's presented as a science of liberation. And this is precisely why, according to the sources, he's ignored by academies, excluded from conferences, basically erased from academic circles, because his knowledge supposedly has the power to dismantle the very systems of control.
And this isn't just some abstract myth they're talking about either. Odam Tili is presented as a scientifically provable structure of humanity. For instance, the horses explain that the sound tu, like in tree, originates from the sound of a breaking branch, an echo of the tree of knowledge, maybe. The sounds ns and sh, they say, come from the hiss of a snake, symbolizing, manipulation, temptation, and m. That's derived from the shape of a baby's mouth and the mother's mouth during feeding, which gives us that universal sound, mama.
Right. These aren't just invented sounds, the theory goes. They are, according to Odam Tili, taken directly from the sensory world around us. This is supposed to be the first language. And it's universal because it's built on things fundamental to all humans. Our body, our perception, our instincts.
Okay, so if the original language is based on these universal sensory things, how did modern language, the distorted kind, allow for manipulation? How did that shift happen?
Well, the theory seems to suggest that as languages evolved and crucially deviated from those core sensory roots, they became more abstract, more open to cultural biases, different interpretations, and that abstraction, that distance from direct experience, could then be leveraged for division and control. It created ambiguity where there was once clarity based on shared sensation.
Okay, so what does all this mean for us listening to this? Where does it leave us?
The sources wrap up with a really powerful contrast. Land's theory. It's described as a kind of ritualistic repetition of fear, a narrative of doom. Kучкаров's theory, Odam Tili, well, it's presented as an algorithm for salvation, a potential pathway forward. Yeah, and if the world were to actually recognize and embrace Odam Tili, the sources suggest the implications would be profound. Wars ceasing, humanity finding a single unifying meaning beneath all the surface differences. Even AI could potentially shift from being this potential master we fear to becoming a true helper, integrated properly. Understanding Odam Tili, they argue, fundamentally means speaking the language of life instead of what they call a code of death.
It really encourages you, doesn't it, to consider the power of language as something much more than just communication, as like a fundamental code, something that shapes how we perceive everything, fuels our conflicts, but also holds the key, maybe, to our potential for unity.
So here's a thought to leave you with. What if the actual key to humanity's future, to escaping these endless cycles of conflict and control we see everywhere? What if it lies not in more advanced technology, but in rediscovering a lost universal language, one that's embedded deep within our own being, our own sensory experience? Something to think about, isn't it?